bodies had been disposed of there. The second investigator, a civilian, concentrated on the Apachev house and did go down to the famous cellar. In the walls and floor, he found bullet holes and spent bullets. On the floorboards, he found bloodstains. He seemed to be making fair progress, but in January 1919, this man in his turn was fired. His boss, General Dietrich, was to write this bitter comment later. If the first investigator was distinguished for laziness and apathy, the second demonstrated a complete absence of the more modest investigative talents and an absolute lack of understanding of the investigator's profession. Yet a third set of detectives, the General's own army men of the Military Investigation Division, were eventually to be dismissed as intolerant, arrogant, and inefficient.
That was a very sad way, I think, to run an investigation.
What about the military agents who were also on the trail in the town of Perm? What sort of criticism did they come in for?
Finally, they were taken off the case. And I think that possibly the real reason there was that some of them devoted more attention than the authorities wanted to a search for the Tsar, and not enough attention to a search for the supposed murderers of the Tsar.
So they weren't convinced he was dead either?
Some of them were convinced quite to the contrary.
A 34-year-old civilian judge, Nicholas Sokolov, became the third and last investigator chosen as the new strongman who would get results. He was a dedicated anti-Bolshevik who disguised himself as a tramp to escape into White Russian-held territory. And it's the Sokolov Inquiry, subtitled An Investigation of Special Importance, that has today become the standard text for accepting the assassination of the imperial family. Following up the clues in the forest, Sokolov launched a major operation, sifting the soil and probing deep in the old mine shafts. The results produced the now accepted Sokolov theory that the bodies of the imperial family were driven, stacked on a lorry, through the dawn of July the 17th along this woodland track to the Four Brothers mine. There, they were stripped and hacked to pieces with saws and axes, and the remains then burned on a huge bonfire. What remained was then further subjected to sulfuric acid, and what was left after that was tossed down one of the mine shafts. But if the assassins really wanted to conceal their crime, their fire and acid routine was a spectacular failure. Sokolov was able to produce literally sackfuls of evidence that now forms the main historical plank for the whole assassination theory. We've managed to get hold of some of the original copies of the photographs that Sokolov himself took, so let's have a slideshow. First of all, the finger. Now, this is the only recognizable piece of flesh and bone that he ever found. Sokolov identified it as a finger that belonged to the Empress, and it was probably, he said, her index finger. Can we have another slide? 42 small fragments of bones. There was evidence that they belonged to mammals and had been subjected to cutting and burning, but they were never positively identified as being human bones. Now, the finger that you've just seen and these bones are all that Sokolov could find physically from 11 corpses. Can we have another picture? Here are some bits and pieces from ladies' corsets, suspenders, hooks, and eyes, and also the remains of some whalebone stays. Those are those long, stringy things. Now, Sokolov said that those were the remains of 6 pairs of corsets, and that would be corsets that belonged to the Tsarina, the 4 Grand Duchesses, and the maidservant, and they did indeed all wear them. Slide, please. Now, this is part of the whole treasury of jewels that were found. This is a very valuable jeweled cross, positively identified as having belonged to the Tsarina, and it was, in fact, a present from her mother-in-law. Can we have another look? This is a large, priceless diamond, said to be part of the imperial crown jewels, again, positively identified as part of the necklace worn by the Tsarina. Now, the seal of identification, you might say, for Sokolov was this, I'm afraid, very bad picture of the body of a dog. He said it was the King Charles Spaniel that belonged to the Grand Duchess Anastasia. There is the Spaniel when it was alive. And he said that the corpse had been preserved in the Siberian ice of the mine shaft and was therefore quite recognizable. For Sokolov, these and similar finds in the forest were strong circumstantial evidence that the family's remains had been disposed of there.
And back in Ekaterinburg, Sokolov also went over the Apachev house in minute detail. In the murder room, he probed the bullet holes, discovered more spent cartridges, and established their caliber. Analysis pinned them down as coming from a Mauser, a Browning, and Russian Nagant revolvers. And curiously, on the south wall, he found a quotation from a German poem which translated as, "On that very night, Belshazzar was murdered by his slaves." The Sokolov report also contains the depositions of a few witnesses. The most important was Paul Medvedev, an ill-educated Bolshevik who became the sergeant major of the Apachev House Guard. He admitted taking the family to the basement, but said he was ordered outside at the moment of the murder, returning a few seconds later to see the still bleeding bodies on the floor. Incidentally, this vital evidence is contradicted by his wife, who swore her husband told her he did take part in the actual shooting. No other guard was found who could give an eyewitness account of the actual murders. By July 1919, as the Bolsheviks retook Ekaterinburg from the Whites, Sokolov, with his evidence packed in these boxes, fled from Russia to France. And it was in Paris, 5 years later, that the Sokolov report was eventually published. Its historical impact was to be conclusive.
When I read it at the time, it seemed to me to have come to all the obviously historically correct conclusions. I didn't go into the question as to how accurate the evidence was, but it seemed to me that there was not in the most likely version, but what was the alternative? My father and mother never ceased trying to find out what had happened, and anybody who came back from Russia or that part of the world either went to see them on their own or King George V sent them down. I have quite a file on their efforts to try and find out what happened. There was the Sokolovsky investigation, which they knew about and I think on the whole accepted. And it wasn't possible to get any more information really than at the time. Now I think that history has shown that the account was right, even though the actual proof at the time may have been lacking.
Lord Mountbatten, to whom the Tsar was Uncle Nicky, recalling the impact of Sokolov on his relatives and the British royal family, an impact that's echoed by the man most personally concerned today, Grand Duke Vladimir of Russia, who lives in exile in Spain as legal heir to the throne of all the Russias, on the assumption the Tsar died in 1918.
Well, I think that, of course, the Sokolov report is basic. And not having anything more or more substantial, I think that we've been obliged, and still are obliged to consider it as valid.
The man whose work still commands such high respect today died in the year of publication. Over Sokolov's grave in Salbris, France, his friends placed a cross with the inscription, "Your truth is truth eternal." But how well does that truth stand the test of time? We submitted the Sokolov report to the most distinguished forensic specialist in Britain.
I've examined that report in detail, and I utterly reject it. It's a classic example of a report wholly prejudiced in favor of a set of required conclusions. Those conclusions, based as they are on a series of assumptions, are inaccurate. This document would not be accepted in any British court today as evidence leading to a formal verdict of death. And in a purely paper sense alone, the imperial family did not die. History has been very ill-served by Judge Sokolov.
Professor Kamps, this is a very serious attack on what appears to be a pretty authoritative report. Before we go into the specifics, what is there in the structure of it that you find so unacceptable?
Oh, I object intensely to the non-objective approach that he's used. What he's done is to take what he wanted to find and made it fit in. Emphatically, this is, if I may say so, rubbish.
Well, let's go into the specifics. A group of men had 3 days and nights in which to dispose of 11 bodies.
They had axes to dismember them, they had 130 gallons of petrol to burn them, and about 35 gallons of sulfuric acid to eliminate the remains. Is this physically possible?
I would say definitely not.
Why?
Well, partly because the action of the heat and the action of the acid neutralize one another out. Secondly, to get rid of 11 bodies completely without leaving heads, teeth, or any other parts of them, other than this small heap of bones, in my mind, just is not on.
But is it that difficult to get rid of bodies?
It is. It's extremely difficult to burn a body. If I may just show you some photographs I brought with me.
What about this body here?
Now, this woman had paraffin or petrol poured over her in a yard to such an extent that part of Hampstead was illuminated, and that's all there is.
But I mean, say that's all there is. There's a considerable amount there.
Yes, but you see, what happens actually is that the body chars, and the charring itself prevents the rest of it being destroyed.
What about destruction by acid, Professor? Surely Haig, the acid bath murderer, was totally successful using that method.
Well, he was successful, I think, partly by luck, but mainly because he, as it were, put the bodies in a petrol oil drum and left them there, and the heat generated with the sulfuric acid dissolved them.
So he created a sort of clinical condition, did he?
That's right.
And what you're saying is that pouring sulfuric acid onto bodies doesn't essentially destroy them. I mean, the acid just destroys some of the skin and then runs into the
Yes,
ground.
it burns, and it runs into the ground around. And I would have thought that the people using it would have probably got more burnt than the actual bodies.
Now, a total of 42 small fragments of bone were found by Sokolov. He says of them, and I quote, "It seems to me that they all belong to a human being." Let's have a look at those bones, can we? And I wonder if you could tell me whether that looks like the earthly remains of 11 people.
Oh, it's fantastic. I think one must give them one point. It looks as though they've been cut or sawn, but you should be able to say definitely whether they're human by proper examination. But that doesn't represent 11 bodies. It doesn't even represent one, I think.
And would you say that they're human?
I don't think you can say that, not from looking at them here. In fact, I think one or two looks very, very much as though they're animal.
With one exception, which I want to raise later in the program, Sokolov found absolutely no skulls or teeth. Does it surprise you that something like 350 teeth and 11 skulls have vanished?
Again, I say it's fantastic. Unless each head was individually chopped off and taken away. But if those heads were in that fire, in a fire, you're bound to get teeth. Teeth are the most difficult things to destroy.
Teeth are positive identification of it. There would have been no argument if teeth had been found. I mean, one could have said those were the Tsar's teeth, and that was it.
If anything had been found, other than clothing.
Well, curious enough, something was found in the middle of all this carnage. Sokolov found one clearly recognizable finger, and he describes it officially as the index finger of a woman of middle age with long, thin fingers and nails that have once been well manicured. It's assumed to be the Empress's finger. Now, I wonder if we can have a look at that finger. There it is. Would you pass the same judgment as Sokolov on that finger?
Emphatically, no. I mean, as I understand it, this was some months afterwards.
9 months afterwards.
Yes. Well, one of the troubles about fingers is, first of all, it would be decomposed. Secondly, even if it had been preserved, it wrinkles. Now, that fingernail there does not look the finger of somebody who's looked after their hands very well.
I wonder if we can have a look at the Empress's hands. There we are. Can you say anything from that? Those are her fingers.
Well, I think you can only say that they're long, slim fingers with well cared for long nails, whereas the other one, the nails have apparently broken down almost to the quick.
You wouldn't then make the same judgment as Sokolov on that finger. I mean, you wouldn't make any judgment except that it's a well-preserved finger.
I don't think it's all that old, actually. No, I think if I were Sokolov, I might, because I think he's practicing the gentle art of self-deception to an incredible degree.
And how is it that after 9 months that finger could be so well preserved from acid, fire, bacteria and rodents and whatever else might chew it?
I don't think it was. I don't think it's been there 9 months.
You think it may have been planted?
I'm sure it was.
Now, a fair amount of clothing and personal effects were found by Sokolov. These pieces have been positively identified as having